This gets a lot of traction, and I thought a lot about it this week, and I do believe it's important that the Bible be considered in terms of themes. And I picked up on a theme that I think is important. So this is, we'll start with this. So Matthew 13. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it. All the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it. Some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Others fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, and still others fell on good soil where it produced a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown. By the way, that they've actually reenacted, put a person on a boat where this took place. The shape of the landscape creates a wonderful amphitheater. You can talk very well to a very large crowd. So that's just a little detail. So a lot, you've read this, we've talked about it. Some people there's varying interpretations of it. The interpretation we're going to use today works well because it fits into the theme, and the theme is appropriate. So the first thing is the path. What was the path? It says, a farmer went out to sow a seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. Well, the path would have been the word, the message that Jesus brought to his people. And the message was, I'm your long-awaited Messiah, but that message wasn't received. The birds ate it up. Today, it's not exactly the same message. Today, it's a little bit broader. Today, the path is the Christian worldview. But the idea of how do you sow seed on ground that will not accept it, that's a theme that we're going to pursue a little bit. The second place was rocky places. And there's been a lot of discussion about these are believers, these are not believers, they fell away. I don't think these are believers. These are people who like what they hear. Their itching ears approve of it, but they have no root. They have no source for their belief, no nutrients. They blossom for a season, but they won't persist. We've seen that, particularly in some of the new church movement today, where somebody calls themselves a Christian and then 6 months later they say they deconstructed their faiths. Well, that is a really shallow understanding of what they even believe. And in fact, I'm not sure they could even articulate what they believe. If you accept the historical resurrection the resurrection as a historical fact, you have a hard time saying, well, I don't believe that anymore, because nothing's really changed between then and 2,000 years ago. In fact, if anything, the scholarship has even become more and more persuasive that the resurrection was historical. So they're shallow. They're not interested in anything except really themselves. When it gets hot, when the sun comes up, they wither because there's no root to withstand the heat. They like the message. They acknowledge that there's a God and there's some higher power and all that. In other words, they're kind of into the religion. But Jesus said two things when people decided. Well, when they had to make a decision about Jesus, said two things. Number one, quit doing what you're doing, repent, and number two, follow me. These people necessarily don't want to do either. They don't want to follow because there might be a sacrifice involved. And they certainly don't want to repent because they like the idea of a hippie kind of Jesus that doesn't really expect much of anything from anybody. So these people fall away. And they will be, when they're tested, the fruit withers, if you will. Now the vine amongst the weeds, that is us to some extent, believers, but we're often choke believers. We preoccupy, we're happy to let the weeds grow all around us. We recognize them, but we're just sort of let them be, right? As long as they don't choke me out, as long as they don't cause me any disruption, live and let live. Now there's a wrong and a right way to play this. You can't, the wrong way would be to say, oh, there's weeds all around me and I've got to hack them out. I'm going to go stand in front of my employer's place of business with a big sign that talks about the evils of X or Y or Z, whatever. That's not necessarily, in fact, I would caution against that. This is more of a call to remove the weeds from your life for reflection. Don't go cleaning up someone else's mess until you've figured out what your mess is. By the same token, Paul did not shy away from controversy. He would walk into places that were not really favorable to the message that he was going to bring, and he brought it. So there's a balance there, right? You have to be willing to stand up for what is true, but at the same time, you first need to be about inspect yourself. And then there's the third one where it says, because if you just read, well, no, that's the believer, and this is where where this started catching. It says, well, they produce 60 times, 30 times, 40 times the return. So my question to you is, well, if that's the case, how many of us have produced 60 or 40 or 30 times what was sown? And you go, oh, well, now that's not the way I want to read it, because I want to read it that the Christian is the last guy. Well, but if the only answer to that is the Christian is the last guy, then what he just described for everybody, that I can say this fairly confidently, what he described for everybody in here is, well, then you're gathering up a whole bunch of weeds, because it would be difficult to say that rate of return has been realized by anyone. So here's the point. And so the individual notion is that, look, get the weeds out of your life and you'll be more productive. And the grace and the mercy of God is that I'll hang with you, stay with you, be with you while these weeds are being removed. It's an appreciation that I'm probably not as into this, committed to this as I need to be. So the subject of that parable is individuals, right? But this is one of the main points of that parable too. The parable isn't so much about salvation. People have read it that way and I say, well, you're missing the point. The point is, what do you do after you're saved? Are you just choked by weeds, or do you produce fruit? And there's two examples where there's two examples of non-Christian. The one that the word doesn't, they just reject the word out of hand. And then the other one who kind of likes parts of the words, pick and choose, but I'm not really going to make a full commitment to it. And the first time that something goes wrong, I'll abandon it. Then there's the other two. There's the Christian that's stuck in the middle of something where they're just not gaining any traction. And then the fourth one is the ideal condition. So it seems to me that there's two descriptions of people that are not believers and two descriptions of people that are. And the question then becomes, if that's the case, then what do you do after you're saved? That's important. All right, so this is where the theme is. The church itself is made up of individuals. So what is expected of the individual, that is fruit, is also passed on to the church as a body. And that's a self-evident, really, right? The church was a result of the resurrection. The cumulative, and this is the early church, the cumulative realization of what Jesus had accomplished resulted in the natural birth of the early church. The church was the result of sowing seed on good soil, and the growth of the early church was explosive as a result. Was the early church just sitting there before it became the church? Who were these people? What were they doing? Well, they were Jews. In many cases, Pharisees, which means they were the Jewish of the Jews. They were highly religious. They had just vehemently decided we need to kill this person, but yet they changed. So that was one group. The other group was the Gentiles. Many times they were pagans. And so the Gentiles had multiple gods, or believed in no gods, certainly didn't believe that there was any special God. Many of the gods that they worshiped were associated with some sort of sexual practice, like in Rome and in the temples in Corinthians, or Corinth, for example. So this mindset of the people that were there, they were not sitting there going, oh, somebody just tell me about Jesus. All I need to do is hear about Jesus. That one group of them was going, we just killed that guy. And the other group was going, so what? He doesn't have any relevance to us. But somehow the message started to stick. The conditions that we face today in the church are very similar to that. Today, people consider themselves more sophisticated, more scientific. And in some camps, particularly the academic camp, they're much more hostile to any worldview that threatens the worldview of naturalism. That is, everything can be explained by what is already here. There is no supernatural. It has to be explained purely from inside the universe framework. Well, they're not sitting there waiting, just going, gee, we all need Jesus. So, a mild criticism, but one of the things that you'll sometimes hear people say, and it's right, but I think it carries the wrong, they just need Jesus. Well, everybody needs Jesus. The question is, why aren't they looking for Jesus? And that's a little bit different. If you look back in the ancient world, Rome practiced pedophilia. What are we dealing with today? Child sex trafficking. Rome practiced pretty commonplace abortion. There was not unheard of. In fact, it was endorsed. The Gentile world, all of that and more, many were connected to, like we said, the sexual practices. The Jewish world hated the man they thought they had rid themselves of. In other words, none of this sounds like fertile soil. So how did the church, the early church, establish a foothold? Well, first of all, the early church had a pretty good introduction, because the early church was, you could argue persuasively, the early church was birthed at Pentecost. Well, it would be a strange thing indeed to stand around and see a bunch of people talking in your own language. So that was kind of a wake-up call to the people. Something special is going on here. Although there were some people that said they're just drunk. It's early in the morning. The seed was already falling on soil that wasn't going to take it. But there were some people who saw that and said, well, then, and Peter says, listen to me. And he gave an argument for the first reason why the soil could be, why you could plant in the soil. And he said, you people, listen to this. And this is in Acts 2. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. He pointed them back to knowledge that they could confirm. You yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. That explanation resonated with those people, obviously. They did remember, they did know that Jesus had done miracles, wonders, and signs, because you can't make that claim to a group of people and then have that people just go, well, he never did anything that I know about. That had to be knowledge. So one of the things that should suggest to us today is that not that we need to expect miracles and signs and wonders today. That's another topic altogether, because the church has sometimes co-opted that, in that if you buy the right rag from the right person, then you get the healing power that comes from that rag, only if you pay $7.95 or whatever that sort of foolishness is. That's not the point. But the point is this: the point needs to be made. Why today, if you're trying to make that point, why is it that Peter could stand up in front of a bunch of people that hated this man and say, he did signs and wonders and miracles? And the answer is because that would have been true. Otherwise, the whole thing would have been just shut down and laughed out of town. This man was, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. We can faithfully say Jesus was definitely a man and Jesus was definitely crucified. And the people that crucified him, when it was pointed out all the things that he had done among them, they had no argument in rebuttal to them. And then the question is, of course, but just killing a man, that isn't ending the story, because the rest of it is that Peter goes on to describe that man that you killed. He's now alive. That prototype, if you will, that original argument is still in play today. The closest enemies of Jesus were the first to hear the message. Why do you think what reason would they have to change what they believe? That's the gospel. That could be gospel, and it could be supplemented by Jesus himself walking on the road to Emmaus, running up to a couple of people and going, "What are y'all talking about? Talking about you must be the only knucklehead around that doesn't know what we would be talking about. We were talking about this guy that we thought was the Messiah. Well, but he got killed, because the Jewish idea was, this is not what the Messiah was supposed to do." And then on that same road, Jesus says, "Didn't you know?" Not look at my hands, look at my feet, look at my side. "Didn't you know that beginning with Moses and the prophets, it all explains why the Messiah had to die?" There's the second strategy is that the death of Christ wasn't just a historical fact. The death of Christ was documented in precise accuracy, with precise accuracy, down to the words that he said. And the description of it in Isaiah about the suffering servant, and he was crushed for our iniquities. And this kind of thing about just being able to read Psalm 2, Psalm 22, and Isaiah 53 with a little bit of Zechariah maybe mixed in there about he came in on the donkey. You've got a picture of what Jesus was telling the men on the road to Emmaus. So on the one hand, after the crucifixion, the biggest enemies of Christianity had to confront the fact that this man had done signs, wonders, and miracles, and now I'm proclaiming to you that he's alive. Why would they believe that? And this is, I think, where we make another mistake. and we've talked about this before, and it was in particular because sometimes we confuse the fact that we need to get the person to challenge their worldview with the fact that we don't agree with their worldview. This is what I mean. It's more important, I think it's probably easier and better and more acceptable to say, why do you think, given that these people saw signs and wonders and miracles and they had killed the man, why do you think, because it says over 3,000 changed their mind in one day, why do you think that occurred? Make the skeptic think, as opposed to saying, well, you're wrong because 3,000 people changed. Now they're going to come up with a reason why that's not the case. Does that make sense? So if you have to begin, but Paul was actually challenging these people to say, think about what you know. So it would be important for the skeptic of today to say, think about what they knew. Because what they knew in Acts is just as relevant as today. Think about these prophecies. Think about Psalm 22. Think about Psalm 2. Think about, just take a few little pieces of those and explain that to them. Because this becomes the role of the church today. Not individuals, yes, individuals, but collectively the church is supposed to be the hands and feet of Christ. The church is supposed to spread the gospel. Go ye into all the world. And it's going to produce churches. What we're trying to do as individuals is to spread the word, and then by spreading the word, then allow those people to pick some place where they become more formally introduced into the deeper parts of it, to where they're not just talking about milk, to where they're not just talking about salvation is all about me, it has nothing, to where they begin to appreciate the width and depth and the scope of it. So that this is where Israel blew it. Israel was picked by God to be the person, the country, the nation that brought forth the Messiah. They did that. But then, after bringing forth the Messiah, they crucified the Messiah because they didn't recognize it. At that point, the seed was falling on hard ground, being consumed by birds. It didn't stay that way, though. Something happened to some of the people in Israel. But the nation Israel, because of its rejection and ongoing rejection of the Messiah, was ultimately judged in a dramatic, final way. There will not be, before this generation passes away, there will not be a stone left unturned over that temple. Sure enough, AD 70, 37 odd years later, there we are. So there was this judgment of Israel, and that's important. Because now I'm going to say something and I'm going to explain. The first thing you're going to say, no, I don't believe that. Let me explain it. The church has assumed the place of Israel, not replacement theology. I'm not talking about that. But this is what I am saying. Israel was to be the nation from which the Messiah came. That seed that was sown, but it was quickly devoured. Israel crucified the chosen one, and they were judged. They were judged for their lack of belief. The church hasn't replaced Israel as a nation, but the church has replaced Israel as the messenger. The messenger is who is this Christ? This is what I received of most importance, Paul says, and this is what I'm passing on to you. Christ lived, Christ was crucified for the redemption of sins, Christ was resurrected on the third day. He learned that from Peter. When he went to Galatians, after he got a little event occurred in his life where he realized, oh my gosh, the seed that I have been planting, the seed that I have been living in, That's the wrong soil altogether. He went from birds devouring the seed. He went from, you want to kill the man? I'll hold your robe and smile while you do it. He went from that to the person that actually was preaching the message to the Gentiles, who was driven to go to Spain, to Greece, to Rome, and all to Turkey, and all points in between. The seed was being multiplied. And when he did that, he would form these churches. And when he would form these churches would be called to the same message, the same mission. And so that now we get another illustration. First we use seeds. Now Paul, he uses something very similar. He uses grafting. And this is what he says in Romans. He says, if the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. Remember what we just heard in the first parable. It had no what? Had no root. If there is no root, then it is not holy. That, I think, is a theme that needs to kind of run through this. The whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you through a wild olive shoot have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap of the root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root supports you. You will say then, well, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in this kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? And boy, this is where everybody's well, it sounds like I can be kicked out of the company, right? I'm going to lose my salvation. I'm grafted in, grafted out. Who's he talking to here? The church. He's not talking about individual salvation. He's talking to the church of Rome. Gentiles and Jews put together. Gentiles and Jews who were trying to figure out, how do we make this thing work? And he points out that there was one group that was originally that was there to bring the message, and they didn't bring the message the way they were supposed to. And so you, the church, have been grafted in. And this is about the church at Rome. But if you don't do what you're supposed to do, I can bring another church in. I can graft them out, I can graft them in. This isn't salvation. This is about, are you attached to the root? And that changes everything. The congregation in Rome was churches that were made up of Jewish and Gentile believers, both of them trying to figure out, what role is Israel going to play in this? So Paul's talking to the church, and he's specifically talking to that church. How do we know that? Because it says this is written to who? Romans. The new group of believers that was responsible for taking what they had been taught and individually making sure that other individuals change their soil from this hardened soil that the birds eat, and to where it's not just choked out, and to where there's no root, that it change it to a soil where there's growth. Israel was responsible for recognizing the Messiah, and Paul is saying that they didn't do it, and he's saying the role of the church is now taking on what Israel was supposed to take on, not replacement theology, because it says in there later, it says those eventually the nation Israel will be restored. Now, when I said that, basically what I said was God can cut a church out of the branches. You say, well, maybe that kind of stings a little bit. Maybe you got a little bit kind of, wait, I don't buy that. I mean, didn't he tell Peter that he would build his church upon the rock? The gates of hell would not prevail against the rock. He was talking about the church, big C. Little c church. There's a little bit of a distinction there. But at the very least, if that kind of entered your head for a second, then you know kind of what the Jews felt when Jesus said over and over again that they failed, they refused to believe. Paul also says, he gives that example, he says, but there's an if there. If the church spreads the seed and nation Israel returns to believe, then they too will be grafted back in. Because they're both drawing resources from the root, which is holy. So the question is, does Christ take churches seriously? Because if you think about it, most of the time when people talk about Scripture, it's at the individual level. But what about the corporate level of the church? Big C church, little c, and all points in between. Well, if you've got any doubts about Christ taking churches seriously, read Revelation. Where he talks to all the churches, and he says, the last one he gets to is the church in Laodicea. He says, you say I am rich. Who's he talking to? The church. You have acquired wealth. You do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. That's not unintentional. Blind. They had in Laodicea, they had a college or a hospital, if you will, for eyes. They had very fine, they had linen or wool that was extremely attractive and very hard to find, and people made their clothes out of it. All of this was alluding to what was actually happening in that town where that church was located. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire so you can become rich, and white clothes to wear so you can cover your nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes so you can see. Which one of these people would have, which one of this group would have been the parable in Matthew? They're choked in weeds. You think, well, I'm rich. I got all this stuff. I got these fine clothes. We got all the. You've got nothing. Those whom I love and rebuke and discipline are those whom I love, I rebuke and I discipline. So be earnest and repent. There it is. Just realize I'm screwed up. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. And we've read that time and time again and say, wow, there's an individual invitation. God's standing at the door. Why was Jesus standing at the door? Because the church was wretched, miserable, and naked. And he's knocking on the door saying what? I got some better soil for you. I got someplace else where you can try planting. This isn't a call to salvation, although it certainly could be interpreted that way. This is a challenge to that collective church. You aren't getting it done. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So, if you take the parable, we've got this soil. Sometimes the soil the word gets ate up before it even hits the ground. And then some other times, it hits the ground, but the people, they kind of like it just a little bit until times get tough. And then they go, not for me. This would be like the psalm leader in the church that after 2 years says, I've deconstructed my faith, or something like that. And then the third one are the ones that's just choked out. You got weeds all around you, but you're not doing anything. You're not weeding. You're just letting the weeds grow. And then the fourth one would be, this is the ideal condition. Jesus just gave the most powerful rebuke to this church. You are naked. You are blind. You're pitiful. And then he turns around and tells that same church, and you have the opportunity to sit on my throne, or sit by my throne, stand by my throne. He gave himself up for the church, but he didn't just give himself up for the church. In fact, Jesus had in Revelation, the church is referred to as what? The bride of Christ. And then following that model in Ephesians, it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Be willing, paraphrasing, be willing to die for her. Be willing to give yourself up just as Christ gave himself up. Christ gave himself up for the soil that doesn't even, the birds don't even give it a chance to hit the ground. He gave himself up for the person who wants to be carnal, who, I'll accept that, but not if it expects anything from me, and they walk away. He gave himself up for the one who just sits sort of in a stupor, a malaise. And then he gave himself up for the one that truly dedicates themselves. But notice what happened. The early church started in the worst kind of soil. And it converted into, some people fell away, some people never claimed it, some people became choked by weeds. All you have to do is read Paul's letters. What are you doing? Where are you going? We'll talk next week. We're going to talk about Corinthians. They were in the weeds. They were all, the weeds were just surrounding them. And Paul's, what are you doing? The Laodiceans thought that they were all that in a box of candy. And Jesus says, you got this all wrong. This is terrible. All right, so what is that? What's the takeaway? Well, as we investigate, first of all, how that message was originally advanced. And the first way it was advanced was by talking to the very people that knew this stuff had happened and just explaining to them, you saw all this, you know he was killed, and now you know he's alive. And that needs to be reconciled against, because somebody come up, those stories were written hundreds of years. That's a different, I can answer that question. No, they weren't. That's just myths. No, they're not. There becomes, the objections start to identify what kind of soil you're actually dealing with at the moment. Because if you can point out to someone and say, well, now explain to me, given these conditions, why do you think those people reacted so strongly to say that they were wrong and they repented? And if you objectively begin to analyze that, you really only come up with one pretty good reason. They concluded that they were wrong. Paul did that. Holding a coat, grinning, hot, you die, you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, you deserved it. Paul went from that to the preacher to the Gentiles, the apostle to the Gentiles. That's because he considered the evidence. Why would you consider there's another? Why would a person who hated Christians ultimately decide that he would be the apostle to the Gentiles? Why would Jesus' half brother, who decided that his brother was insane, why would he ultimately be thrown off the top of the temple, 150 feet, and die? Now, I'm not saying this stuff is true. I'm just saying these are historical facts. I'm not saying you decide whether the resurrection is true. but those are the facts that support. Now you have to make up your own mind. That's the way the early church planted seed. And I think, so where I'm going with it is this. Somehow or another, I would like for everybody to brainstorm how we can replicate in a non-confrontational, I don't want to stand out on the corner with a sign that says, Jesus said you're going to hell. Inquire within. But how can we reach the common person out there? And if you don't think they're biblically illiterate, just go read a couple of things on Facebook, and they're beyond illiterate. Their soul is pretty shallow. How can we? And I'm not talking about whether they come. I don't care if they come here or never come to. But how can we begin to advance the same message that Jesus evoked on the road to Emmaus, Paul evoked in Jerusalem for Pentecost? How can we get the historical evidence of the resurrection in front of somebody in such a way that they have to wrestle with the facts and then leave the rest to God? That is our challenge. That's our charge. Because if we don't do that, and we don't take that seriously, then I think we're probably more like the Laodicean church than we would like to believe we are. And the beautiful thing about this is, since I am no longer gainfully employed, I now have a little bit more time to see about hoeing some weeds. So I challenge everybody, when we come back next week, think about this. Think about how we collectively can advance the same message historically in a way that places the burden upon the person hearing it, that they have to consider it, they have to think about it, they have to wrestle with it. So we're not so much, this is that, forgive me for taking a couple more minutes before we get to communion, but this is not the traditional Baptist way of evangelizing. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Says who? Jim dealt with that. How's your walk? What's wrong with my feet? No, I mean your walk with God. God who? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We can say that if you believe what? The Bible to begin with. But if you have no basis to believe the Bible, then I'm starting off from a position of what? Incredulity. Why should I believe what you've got to say? It needs to be nowhere in the early church did you find anyone saying, for all have fallen short. Paul went into churches and he proved through Scripture that Jesus was the Messiah. How do you suppose he did that? I suspect prophecy would have been the primary way. Peter, you see the deal? So this is not quote unquote evangelization in the traditional sense of what most people would think about. This is about really, how do you just give somebody a reasoned, historically based, fact-based argument that they have to think about? Everybody got their homework? And that, I will suggest to you, will create fertile loam. Good soil. Soil that can be, soil that is open to, okay, I can understand why you're saying that now. Let me hear the rest of the story. And if it doesn't, it would be the process that the apostles used and that Jesus himself used. So I'd say it was good enough for them. So today we celebrate communion. And we celebrate basically as a reminder of what Jesus had done. So, Steve, would you, Tom, if you could grab that, please. We have the bread, the body. We have the grape juice, the blood. The cup was a cup of redemption. People are redeemed by the blood of Christ. Redeemed simply means is that you now have value again. You had no value until you were redeemed. In the same way, the body is what provides the opportunity for redemption. It was broken. This is the gospel. It's what I'm passing on in first parts, Paul said. Christ lived, Christ died for the redemption of sins, Christ rose again on the third day. That is something that we have to be able to factually reconcile, to factually understand, to factually agree with, because if that's the case, then we don't have to worry about, well, at some point you might get choked with weeds, but your root will never wither. Now the problem is, let's get rid of the weeds. But that's a different deal from being turned away altogether. So, do this in remembrance of me. This is my body broken. And then this is Christ's blood shed for the redemption of sins, shed for all sins. Drink it. That's been going on for 2,000 years, and it'll go on until Christ returns. So remember the sacrifice of D-Day 80 years ago, and remember the sacrifice of Friday 2,000 odd years ago. Because both of them bought freedom and liberty for all of us. Father, we thank you for the day. We thank you for the time. We thank you for the challenge. We thank you for the parable of the seeds, for us to reflect a little bit about just exactly who am I, where am I, and how much can I change with your help. We thank you for the Laodicean church as an example of something that was so weak, but yet the promise that was made to them was so incredible. Once we are attached to the root, we are holy. And we thank you that you can take that opportunity to break those branches off. If that church is completely ineffective, then it might be time for another church. May we never fall into that scenario. May our little band of brothers be a place that glorifies you. And may we take the challenge of how do we spread this message in such a way that we can create opportunities for the best soil. May we take that seriously, because you did.